Okay, hello again. So my name is James Lang, and I am a founding member of the Prevention Collaborative and currently serving on the Collaborative's Stewardship Committee. I am also supporting this webinar series for the first cohort of mentors. I will be doing this for the next few months to get us moving on reflecting and sharing and deepening the understanding of some of the key themes related to prevention that you started in your conversations in Istanbul. So on behalf of the Prevention Collaborative, I am delighted to welcome you to this interactive webinar. This is the first webinar of our learning group, and so I hope it goes really well and that you enjoy it and you find it useful. Okay, so now to the substance of today's webinar. As background to the topic of elevating the value of practice-based learning, I'd like to say a few things about how this theme is evolving within the Prevention Collaborative, and to really emphasize the fact that it is an evolving theme and area of work. So in our thought piece, the paper Reimagining Prevention, we presented the overlapping problems like a problem statement, which outlined these biases that we find are hindering the prevention field. So I'm not going to go too deeply or into too much detail about that paper, but I encourage those who have not read it to please do so and to provide us your comments. And I want to thank this group for providing comments so far. And I will be consolidating those and helping to edit that paper for a newer version. But what we outlined in terms of this problem statement are these hierarchies of knowledge, learning, and financing that we feel tend to disadvantage the local groups and activists working on the prevention of violence against women and children in low resource settings. The emphasis of donors on evidence-based programming models often means that money flows to groups well versed in that specific scientific language of evidence-based prevention, and those that are able to speak and write in English in this way, and those that are willing to reproduce evidence-based models, and also, of course, those that are willing to undertake and engage in work with researchers on experimental evaluations. So in short, this system seems to benefit those who are fluent in the evidence-based discourse, but can leave a whole group or lots of other folks out, including the social movements and activists that are working to push local changes and the potential prevention interventions that emerge from local settings. So clearly the Prevention Collaborative is not anti-science, nor are we opposed to adapting evidence-based models. You've learned a lot about the synthesis of this evidence base and what some members of our group think about it in Istanbul. But recognizing these biases within the aid industry, we are compelled to seek ways to overcome and flatten these hierarchies of knowledge, financing, and learning that are all interrelated, and that tilt the system away from our main constituency, which is local women's organizations and activists. So to do this, we must recognize that other types of learning and knowledge are essential for good prevention. It's not only evidence-driven. We must help elevate and legitimize these other types of knowledge and learning and synthesize them with the current evidence literature. So this is the long-term agenda that we hope we can start with you in this seminar and in subsequent conversations that will flow from this. We hope that many of you will join us to undertake and refine ways forward to this end. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that the Prevention Collaborative is what we make it. It's not a top-down organization. As you know, it's very new. We're not tried and tested, but rather we are an evolving and fluid process of creating new ways of working together. And in this spirit, I hope we can move forward to help uncover ways to synthesize different kinds of knowledge and learning. And we'll talk more about this at the closing. But now I'd like to turn to the introduction of Sophie. Sophie Nami is our wonderful speaker, and we are so pleased to have her today. She was the learning coordinator at Raising Voices in Uganda for 4 years, where she helped develop an organizational research and learning strategy. She co-led a study on adapting SASA for different contexts and explored the intersections between violence against women and violence against children. Prior to Raising Voices, she worked as an evaluation specialist with the International Center on Research on Women, ICRW, and there assessed programs to address violence and change in gender and social norms. She is currently continuing to support Raising Voices as a remote consultant, and is excited about working with this inspiring group of prevention collaborative mentors. So with that, Sophie, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, James, for the nice introduction. Thanks for being here with us. There's 15 of us now or so that's really great, and I really appreciate, especially those of you who it's early morning and late night. So thanks so much for being part. So before jumping into the content, I just wanted to make one small note in terms of framing for this presentation. So it's really intended as a springboard for conversation and discussion along the ideas and questions that James has just framed for us so nicely. And so some of the slides, some of the ideas on the slides are still in early stages of development and will definitely be benefiting from your comments and reflections. So just asking you to please keep that in mind as I go through the slides here. Okay, so our starting point is really an acknowledgement of the many different forms of knowledge that exist. And some are more valued and practiced in certain spaces than in others. And here you can see a few. There's, I'm sure, many more. This isn't comprehensive. Just to emphasize that knowledge is vast and the pursuit of knowledge can take on many forms and expressions. And today we're going to focus in on these two because of the strong influence that both scientifically derived knowledge and practice-based knowledge has on our fields. And I think there's also this very exciting potential for both of these types of knowledge to work synergistically in the service of stronger, more transformative programs to prevent violence against women. To facilitate the conversation today, we wanted to take a moment to look at some loose definitions of what we mean when we talk about scientifically derived knowledge and when we talk about practice-based knowledge. So we're using scientifically derived knowledge as a shorthand for the knowledge that's acquired through, quote unquote, scientific methods. So thinking here about inductive or experimental inquiry that really starts with a hypothesis and goes through a pretty clearly defined process of collecting data, making observations, drawing conclusions, etc. And there's some assumptions of objectivity, truth, or fact within this sphere of knowledge, though that's not universal, and there's definitely nuances here as well. On the other hand, when we're talking about practice-based knowledge, we're referring to the cumulative knowledge that's acquired from designing and implementing programs over a sustained time frame. So that includes the insights you get from observations, from your own direct experiences, and from program monitoring data. And this is the definition that we've been using at Raising Voices. So historically, as is no surprise to us, practice-based knowledge is not as well documented or disseminated as scientifically derived knowledge, but we are trying to change that. So as James has shared for us in his introduction, the current paradigm tends to prioritize and value scientifically derived forms of knowledge more than the knowledge acquired by practice. Of course, there's subtleties here, and we even have certain hierarchies within the scientifically derived knowledge. So thinking about quantitative methods versus other methodologies. But I think as a general paradigm, this is pretty representative, and this holds up fairly well. And then the long-term aim within the collaborative is really to have this more balanced perspective. So the balance scales on the right, where both forms of knowledge are mutually valued and recognized, and for the unique contributions and potential to enhance the work to really be brought to the fore. Okay, so how can we start to move this ambition forward? I think this is really tricky because even though, I think many of us talk about this, there hasn't been extensive documentation or thinking about the how-to side of practice-based knowledge. So for example, if you just start Googling documenting practice-based knowledge or elevating the value of practice-based knowledge, you're not going to find many examples popping up. And yet, when we reflect on some of the conversations that we started in Istanbul and resources like the Reimagining Prevention paper, there are some foundational seeds that we can in place that we can draw on. And in this slide and the ones that follow, I've tried to concretize some of this initial thinking so that we have a starting framework for how we can advance this aim within the collaborative and our learning partnerships. And this is just a draft that we can then start to critique and improve in the discussion side of the webinar today. So I hope that sounds okay. So the starting point is ensuring a shared understanding of what practice-based knowledge is, why it's important, and how it may differ from other forms of knowledge. And then in the next bubble, if we're thinking about having a robust body of practice-based knowledge, that's really driven and led by activist organizations and groups that are doing this work day to day, then it seems that nurturing a learning culture within organizations is really critical. And the word culture is pretty big. I think that this is a pretty ambitious scope, actually, that starts off with individual curiosity and skill building, but then has aspects of collective reflection and really helping organizations have processes in place where they can start to share and build on each other's learning and to learn as an entire organization. The third step is around solidifying practice-based knowledge, and we went back and forth with what to call this bubble, but okay, so maybe if we take a step back from the slide for a moment and just think more philosophically on the pursuit of knowledge. So irrespective of what form of knowledge or what method, there's some mental rigor and discipline required whenever you try to formulate knowledge or acquire knowledge. So just because you have a thought or an idea, it doesn't immediately become codified or integrated. And one example I was thinking about is something that happens to me all the time. I don't know if others will relate, but you're about to fall asleep and you have like this most amazing insight and you think it's so brilliant. And then from there, a few things can happen. You can wake up in the morning, which often happens to me, and it's just gone. It's like a completely fleeting insight that you can't even recollect in the morning. Or maybe you're awake, you've had your coffee, you revisit it, and you realize, gosh, this is like not as brilliant as I thought it was. It just doesn't really hold up at that point. And then there's another option where maybe you have this idea, you start to talk about it with a friend or a colleague and you build on it. And it becomes a seedling of something that is solid and can grow and can develop and that can change the course of your work or your life in some impactful way. So I don't know if that example is helpful, but the idea here is that in order to solidify experiences as something concrete, we need to engage with them and help to draw them out. And when you think about scientifically derived knowledge, it's very strong on this point, right? There's a scientific method. You have a whole process in place for doing this. And yet for practice-based knowledge, we just don't have as much. And that, I think, is a real opportunity for us as mentors and as the collaborative to find creative ways to do this effectively and help draw out and strengthen the practice-based knowledge that we have in the field. And finally, if we really want to start tipping the scales and change that paradigm, we need to make sure that this practice-based knowledge gets documented and out into the world. And I think already in Istanbul, there were quite a few ideas floating around on how to do this well. Okay. So to help illustrate these ideas a little bit more practically, I'm just going to share some of our experiences at Raising Voices, where this intention of elevating the value of practice-based knowledge has been part of the strategy for the past few years. And one of the interesting things about Raising Voices is that learning is very explicitly one of the 3 core pillars of the work, alongside practice and influencing. The overall goal of learning is to nurture and sustain a culture of reflection, synthesis, and action that generates practice-based knowledge and expands global understanding of how to prevent violence against women and violence against children. So you can see that many of the same language that was on the previous slide is reflected here. You guys, I'm just going to take a drink of tea. Hold on one sec. Okay, that's a lot of talking. Okay, so when we talk about nurturing a learning culture, we're really intentionally trying to shift, to influence organizational level shifts. We do things that are more around building skills and provoking and sometimes even incentivizing curiosity and risk-taking across teams and across individuals within teams. And also prioritizing space for collective reflection and discovery. I think both Katie and Devin are on the webinar, and they are both have been part of Raising Voices for some time. And we do a lot of processes. We really try to not let those longer strategy sessions and reflection sessions fall down the priority list. We also have, in terms of core ingredients of nurturing a learning culture, just the very fact that learning is right up there alongside practice and influencing does send a powerful message that being a learning organization is core to the identity at Raising Voices at every level. Another thing that we've tried to tease out a bit is being very mindful of how we use our language around learning. So for example, many organizations have M&E teams, but not so many have learning teams. And what we've found is that that word learning is a much more inclusive frame, where everyone is responsible and everyone is aspiring to be a skilled learner. And on the other hand, when you talk about monitoring, it tends to connote these tick boxes or external experts coming in, which seems to contribute to this misperception that many organizations have that M&E can be an isolated activity within a specialized team, rather than a central part of good programming. We use some structural support levers, so having good knowledge management platforms in place, and also just thinking about templates for report writing or note taking, and having an explicit space to document that link between learning and strategic decision making. And then finally, there's staff-wide activities, so diverse ways that acknowledge different learning styles, and also ensuring that everyone within the organization has a chance to lead in organizational learning efforts. So I'm not going to talk about these too much, but we do have learning circles, which are several months dedicated to learning about an issue of cross-cutting importance at the organization through different angles and perspectives. We had our first Fail Fair last year, which was interesting. I mean, it takes some careful framing, but as long as it's well introduced and there's safe space, it can be a really potent way to encourage risk-taking and also to learn by what doesn't work, which is actually where a lot of learning comes in. Okay, sorry, the slides were skipping ahead. So a lot of our efforts within learning at Raising Voices are intended to generate credible and robust practice-based knowledge, while at the same time trying to stay true to our people and program-centered approach. So in other words, it's really critical that we design our assessments and L&E activities with the practical applications in mind from the beginning. So it's not just collecting data for data's sake. And to give you an example, our organizational learning and evaluation system is based on these team-specific learning frameworks. And those frameworks start by asking each team, what is it that you feel is most essential to learn about your work? What questions do you want to be able to answer about how your programs are rolling out and what impacts they're having? And from there, we start to develop the benchmarks and indicators. We also have program learning assessments, which we We call them PLIs, Program Learning Initiatives. And these are deeper dives into process-oriented questions that can feed back into programmatic decision-making. So this is more about a rapid assessment and creative methodology that doesn't require extensive research expertise so that it can be turned around quickly. So for example, I think both Devin and Katie worked on a PLI a few years ago to understand the experiences of participants in Raising Voices Violence Prevention Learning Center courses. So we wanted to improve the structure of those courses to better facilitate the integration of theory and practice. And what we did was we did interviews with former course participants, we talked to EDs, we talked to some donors, and then we had a lot of conversations to look at what some of our key informants were sharing and how we could reflect that back into the structure of the next round of courses. And then I think this next bullet is really important. So taking deliberate steps to go beyond the numbers. As we've been discussing, learning is much more than what we can document. It's much more than what we can measure. And so here what we're trying to do is open the scope to reflect and really interrogate and draw out the day-to-day programming challenges, solutions, and questions, which might be a part of your formal monitoring, but it might not. So in this way, you can start to actualize that tight feedback loop between learning and strengthening programs. So for example, with SASA, there's bi-monthly meetings for all the community activists to come together and share their positive and negative experiences. And they might also look at some of the M&E trends that are emerging, but that would be, one part of that conversation. At some point at Raising Voices, we were really doing a lot of these learning activities. We had these program learning assessments, we had staff development sessions, tutorials, critical reading sessions, learning circles, all these things. And we sat back and asked ourselves, is all of this investment and all of this energy really making a difference to the way we are going about our work and to who we are as an organization? And there was definitely a lot of positive things to talk about, but I think there was also a bit of a painful answer that came out there, that some of our learning wasn't being integrated as well as it could, and without this critical link. It actually can really become just overwhelming, where you have additional processes, additional pieces of work, and each one of those generates more action points and things that need to be followed up. So this slide reflects some of our ideas around strengthening this critical step of integration. And I think really important is this close collaboration between learning and practice teams, which speaks to the idea of co-creation and exchange. And, I think this might be one of the reasons why all those very large development initiatives with the 20-page log frames, and they have big M&E teams, and they do an awesome job of collecting a lot of data, but they don't always learn. I mean, some do, but others don't learn in a way that contributes to programming agility and responsiveness. So these conversations are really important. We also started calling some of these reflective sessions reflect and act sessions. And it's semantics in a way, it's the overall framing, but having this word act helps to signal that the whole purpose, the whole motivation for the session is to propel ourselves towards action. So for example, each team at Raising Voices twice a year has a reflect and act session on their team L&E framework. And what's emerging from that, and in that space, they're expected to document a few of the tangible changes that they will be making, or that they hope to make to strengthen their programming based on what's been discussed through the session. And then this slide is about how we get our story and our learning out there in a way that lands credibly and can be taken up by other organizations. And I think this is where we can collectively start to elevate the overall value as practice-based knowledge, as more and more of these learning outputs are out there to reference and to circulate. And at Raising Voices, we do this using several different styles and formats. We have learning papers that are a bit longer, a bit more formal, and they include some external peer review. We also do programming for prevention briefs, which are more around the nuts and bolts of quality programming. The creative change stories series are nice because they're shorter. They're normally 2 pages, and they're really to highlight innovations or unique challenges that some of our program partners are experiencing. And then we have popularizing research, which is to facilitate access to more academic work. So Devin helped us with the SASA popular report, which compiles all of the academic literature from the SASA randomized controlled trial, which at this point there's 10 or 12 peer-reviewed articles, and tries to put it in one place in an accessible format. And here are just some visual examples of what these learning outputs look like, and they're all available on the website as well. So we wanted to include this last slide as a reminder that even with these quote unquote like more objective forms of knowledge, we still need to ensure that our feminist values are well reflected to maintain the politicized nature of our work. And I'm not going to spend too much time here. I think we'll be sharing the slides after today's webinar, but at Raising Voices, this very explicitly feminist and activist organization, it was really important for the learning team to clarify for ourselves how we remain accountable to feminist principles. And these ideas, I don't think they're pretty intuitive, but yet having it documented in this way and having this guidance for us to refer back to felt important and felt quite meaningful for the team, and to hold our work, connect our work to all the other really politicized work happening across Raising Voices. And I think one of the big things that I will just talk about for a moment is thinking about unintended consequences and monitoring potential backlash, because we all know that this is common to many programs that are seeking to transform gender norms and to prevent violence. And if we don't have ways to systematically capture that kind of unintended consequence, then we might miss out on a pretty critical dimension of our programs.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for your active participation. And you'll hear from us via email. And those of you that are interested in the smaller group discussion, we'll take this forward. So thanks so much, and we'll sign off now. Have a great day.